Hey guys, I just wanted to walk you through the steps for creating a basic Lego style building block in Onshape. For those of you who are still having trouble with your block design, this might be helpful. I'm going to create New Part Studio as kind of the blank starting point for creating your block. And as I mentioned before, there is no wrong way of doing this. Any way that works is a good way of doing it. There are some ways that are creating this block that are easier than others, and I'm going to go through one way that you can do this. I'm going to start with the sketch, and I'm actually going to start by sketching the top view of the Lego block. So for my default plane, I want to select the top plane. This is going to be the starting point. And you guys know all CAD drawings start with the sketch. I'm going to click the magic cube up here to reorient my camera, zoom out a little bit, and I can start sketching here on this top plane. I'm going to work through the basic 2x2 building block. So to start with the general profile of the top view, I'm going to use what's called a center point rectangle. To make this design a little bit easier, I'm going to start from the origin, and the center point rectangle lets me keep my rectangle centered at that origin. I'm just going to size that to something, click to save my rectangle. Not worried about the size at this point, because what I'm going to do next is actually go in and set some dimensions. So if you have your technical drawing out, it's going to be real easy to reference what the correct dimensions are. Ooh, that's not right. So I'd recommend having that drawing out so you can real easily see what the size of the different features of your design should be. I'm using some of the dimensions, measurements that I can remember from the technical drawing I did. So your measurements may be a little bit different. That's fine. So the basic profile for the 2x2 block is square. And once I have this two-dimensional profile, obviously I want to make this 3D, and the tool to do that is going to be an extrude. So I'm going to extrude this, and if you rotate the camera around, you see that it's extruding it up. Looks like it's going way too far up. I'm going to set that depth to whatever measurement you've taken for the height of the block. So that looks like a more appropriately sized Lego block. Hit the green check mark to save, and that is the general shape of the block. So my recommendation when you're working with CAD, especially if you're working with things that are a little bit complicated, is to start with the general shapes and add specific details to the general shape as you proceed through the design. So the general shape of my Lego, my building block, is just this solid block. So what I'm going to do next is to actually go in and add some of those details. And the details I'm going to start with is the top of the block. So I click to create a new sketch, and I want to sketch the profile of the top of the block. To do that, the sketching plane that I'm going to use, it's not going to be one of these default planes. It's actually I'm going to sketch directly on the top of this block. And you can actually, if you mouse over the top of the block, it selects that square flat surface of the block. So I'm going to click that, reorient this so I'm viewing this from the top, and now I can sketch directly on my block. So if I'm sketching the top, looking at this block from the top, what I'm going to see are 4 circles. Well, I'm going to start by creating one circle, and I'm going to use some fancy tools to create the rest of these circles from this one circle. So let me dimension that circle after I've got it drawn. I'm not worried about position yet. I'm going to fix that here in a minute. Let me drag this over to the center so it looks a little more in the correct place, and I think that's a little too small. There we go. So that's one block, correctly dimensioned. You may have measurements that tell how far this circle should be from the sides. You can include those as well. But to create the rest of these blocks, we could go through and create 4 more circles and dimension them and space them, and it's going to be a little bit more work. One quick shortcut is to use what's called a linear pattern tool. That's up here in the top menu. What that linear pattern tool does is takes part of a sketch and repeats it a certain number of times in the horizontal direction, repeats it a certain number of times in the vertical direction. So I'm going to click that tool, click this circle, and zoom out a little bit. And you can see it's repeating this. So I've got 3 copies in the horizontal direction. I'm going to click this arrow up here and drag this down. So I've got 2 copies in the vertical direction. I'm going to click this arrow and drag in these horizontal copies. Now, I don't want 3 copies. I just want 2 copies for this 2x2 block. But if you're working with some of the other rectangular blocks, you can change the number of times these patterns are repeated by changing this 2x. So that 2x, 2x, that's 2 copies in either direction. That gives me 4 total circles. You can go through and adjust the spacing both horizontally and vertically. I think I did some measurements to calculate that. Depending on what dimensions you have written down in your technical sketch, you might have to do just a little bit of math to figure out what the space in between the center points of these circles needs to be. But once you've got that spaced like you want, hit the green. There's a green check mark by the mouse key, so hit the left mouse button to save that. And there you've got the 4 circles that represent the cylinders on the top of the block. So to create the actual cylinders, obviously I need to extrude these circles. So I'm going to go through, select each of these circles. You may need to zoom in and out to select those. Go up here and hit extrude. And that's going to extrude those circles to make cylinders on the top. I want to make sure I'm adding that to my existing block. I don't want to create new parts. So that looks good. And of course I can set the depth of this extrude should be the height of those cylinders. So whatever measurement you've got recorded in your technical drawing is what you should use for that. And so that right there is the top of the block. And that, just kind of doing a quick visual inspection, looks pretty close to me. So to add details to the bottom, I'm going to go through this same process, except I'm going to rotate the camera around, create a new sketch, and I'm going to select not one of the default planes, but I'm actually going to select the bottom of the block. So I click the bottom view of the block. I'm going to click this bottom view of the magic cube up here to reorient my camera and zoom in a little bit. Now I can sketch the bottom profile of the Lego block directly on the bottom of the block that I have made. So we've got the outside edge, and we've talked about this before. That edge has a thickness to it. So to create that thickness, I want to create a center point rectangle that's a little bit smaller than this block. And so once I've got that, you should have some dimensions that have measured the thickness of those edges. You'll have to add that on 2 different sides, specify those dimensions on 2 different sides to fully define this. So that adds a thickness to the Lego block. I've also got that cylinder in the middle, and that cylinder's got thickness as well. And I'll use a center point circle for that. Again, having this rectangle lined up with the origin makes it easy to do this design. So I'm going to create the big circle. I'm going to dimension that. And then I'm going to create another center point circle inside that to provide the thickness for that cylinder. And so again, you should have those measurements. If you don't have those measurements, you'll have to get your calipers out and take those measurements again. So right now, all the lines are black, so there's no blue lines left over, so I've got everything fully dimensioned. I'm ready to extrude. Now, I'm going to do a little bit different with my extrude. Instead of adding something to my extrude, I'm going to use the remove feature of extrude to hollow out this block. And so I want to hollow out this big area inside here, and also want to hollow out the inside of this cylinder. And so if you click those 2 areas, I'm going to click extrude, and you'll see it'll default to adding material to your extrude. That's not what I want. I want to actually remove this in order to hollow it out. So I'm going to click remove. And so it's removing in the other direction, and you can see that it's removing past the top of the block. You can drag this to position this remove manually, or if you've taken this measurement, this depth measurement, you can use that as well. So once you have that, hit the green check mark to save that. I'll do a quick visual inspection, and that looks like my basic building block. You can see the bottom's hollowed out. We've got the 4 cylinders evenly spaced on the top. That looks reasonably good to me. Again, this is just one way you can do this. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. But if you're having trouble getting started, maybe start here.